Well, a few years ago, I was kind of looking through my yearbook from high school, from 1977. Now, I don't know how you do it here in Singapore, but whenever you go to high school, every year at the end of the year, there's a yearbook, and you have all the pictures of the students, the faculty, current events, the sports teams, the music teams, and so forth. And here I was looking at this yearbook from 1977, and I was reading some of the inscriptions that some of the people had written in my book. I don't know how it is with you, but often that yearbook is passed along, and people write little nice messages to one another. And I was reading an inscription by a friend by the name of Steve. We'll call him Steve. And Steve was my best friend in high school. Steve and I spent countless hours kind of hanging out in the library, talking about sports and politics and girls. Now, we didn't actually know very many girls, but we sure liked to talk about them, hour after hour. We just enjoyed each other's company. And so Steve and I were very good friends, and I moved away after 1977 to a different place, different part of the world, and so he and I were out of touch for a very, very long time. Well, again, a few years ago, I decided it'd be nice if I could get a hold of Steve. I'd like to reconnect with him. He was my best friend in high school. I'd like to be his friend once again. So, I didn't really know where to start, but I figured I'd start with my wife's Facebook. I didn't have a Facebook page at that time, but I went to my wife's Facebook, and I did a search using his name. Now, she didn't really appreciate the fact that I was using her Facebook to kind of troll for men that she didn't know. But how else was I going to find my friend Steve? So anyway, I did a search, and I found Steve's Facebook account. And so I wrote him a message. This is Edward Hill, from high school, and you and I were very good friends, and I'd really like to reconnect with you. Would you be willing to do that? Well, a couple of weeks went by, months went by, and I got no response. Now, that didn't really bother me too much because it looked like it was a dormant account. And so, he just wasn't using Facebook. Now, I was able to kind of pick up, and you can go to the next slide. I was able to pick up from the Facebook account that he lived, in a particular city, Portland, Oregon, and he worked for a particular company. So I thought, well, look, maybe I'll just write a letter. So I got the address of the company. I wrote a letter. To Steve, I said, Steve, this is your old friend Edward Hill. It's been 35 years. I remember we were such good friends. I came across our yearbook. I'd really like to reconnect with you. I sent the letter. Days went by, weeks went by, no response. Okay, so I kind of forgot about it for a while. Then a few years later, maybe about 2 years ago, I happened to be in Honolulu, Hawaii. And it was December 7th. And that's a significant day in the history of Hawaii because that's the day that the Japanese military attacked the Pearl Harbor Navy base in Hawaii, and that led to the United States joining World War II. That's a big day for Americans. And so on December 7th in Honolulu, they have a parade, a big parade. Hundreds of thousands of people coming to watch this parade, which honors, the veterans of December 7th. And so I'm watching this parade with thousands of people, and I start talking to the guy next to me. And we just start sharing information as we're watching this parade. And it turns out he's from the same city as my friend Steve. And then I asked him, well, where do you work? And it turns out he worked for the same company as my friend. So I asked him about my friend. And he said my friend had retired, Steve had retired, but he knew my friend. I said, look, if I gave you my contact information, would you be willing to pass it along to Steve? Because I'd really like to reconnect with him. So he said he'd be happy to do that. Well, I was quite encouraged at this point. So I gave him the information. Well, days went by, weeks went by, no response. So this takes me to last month because I finally got my own Facebook account. And people out there, I need friends. I have very few friends. So look me up, become my friend. I will accept you if you'll accept me. Okay. Anyway, so I've got my own Facebook account. So I decided, look, I'm going to try again to connect with Steve. He was my best friend. He wrote a beautiful inscription about me in my yearbook, how much he valued our friendship and all that. So I thought, well, look, maybe what I can do is I can find out if Steve has a spouse. Maybe I can reach him through his wife. So I put in his name, his last name, and eventually I started to get the last name of people, and I found a woman who was about his age, who lived in the same city, and who happened to work for the same company. So I sent her a Facebook message. Hi, you don't know me. My name is Edward Hill. I think it's possible that you're married to my very good friend Steve. I would really like to get in touch with Steve because he and I were best friends in high school. And I waited, and then I got a message back about a day later. I'll ask him. So that was good news. I'd finally got to somebody who could get to Steve. Well, to make a long story short, that was about 4 weeks ago. And guess what? After 5 years of searching, Steve still hasn't got back to me. And you know what? I'm starting to get the impression that maybe Steve really doesn't want to have anything to do with me anymore. And I have to admit, it hurts a little bit. Because he and I were good friends. And I remember reading that inscription. Ed, I value our friendship. Thanks for all that you've done for me. Let's stay in touch. But the reality is that Steve has moved on in life. And I think I've given up my search. So look, become my friend, will you, on Facebook? Well, look, the reality is that people in life who love us today, who cherish us today, who care for us today, who live sacrificially for us today are the same people who sometimes forget about and shun us tomorrow. That's just one of the harsh realities of life. Sometimes personal relationships between people who care has a limited lifespan. We've all been through it, and it's not very pleasant when it works out that way. But the good news that I want to share with you today is that we have a God who never gives up in his pursuit of us. He keeps on coming. He keeps on forgiving. He keeps on searching. He keeps on pleading. He keeps on looking for us. He keeps his concern for us. He keeps compassionate for us. He keeps on forgiving, and he keeps on loving us, even when we will shun his overtures. The desire of God to lavish his love upon us is perhaps best expressed by the familiar words of John 3:16. You know them well. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. Well, look, there's a lot of wonderful love stories that we could talk about in the world. There's a lot of beautiful expressions of love, like Officer DePrimo that I talked about earlier. But how much more is the love of God for you and for me that he lavishly wants to share with us? And that's really what I want to focus on today, is just to have a good reminder of this incredible story of God's love for you and for me. God's love, first of all, my friends, is a story of an unreasonable love. It's a story of an unreasonable love. For God so loved the world. It's an unreasonable love. And what I mean by that is it's unreasonable in the sense that it's offered often in the face of rejection. It's often ignored and almost always taken for granted. When things go wrong, we're often quick to blame God. And when things are going well, we often are quick to take credit for the blessings that we've received rather than giving glory to the Lord above. And yet God still loves us. He still searches for us. He still wants to lavish his caring compassion upon us. It's a story of an unreasonable love. I know of a woman who has wasted much of her life on the abuse of drugs and alcohol. In fact, her addiction is so deep that it's not unusual for her to share a cigarette of marijuana, a marijuana cigarette, with her son when he comes home from school. That's how deep her addiction is. She's somebody who's slept around. She's hardly had a good job or a lasting job. She's broken relationships with about everyone who cares about her. She's dishonored her friends, and she's dishonored her parents. And yet when I was having lunch with the sister of that woman not too long ago, she told me that her mother continues to care and show concern and protect that adult child. You see, a mother's love continues even in the face of rejection, even in the face of embarrassment, even in the face of unconcern. A mom's love helps us get a glimpse of God's unreasonable love for us. You see, even in the face of rejection, indifference, and abuse, God still cares. God's love for you and me, it's an unreasonable kind of love. He so loved the world even when we shun him and abuse him. God's love is also the story of an unreserved love. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. God held nothing back. He gives his all. The story goes that there was a chicken and a pig having a conversation. It happens all the time. A chicken and a pig having a conversation. And they were saying that, look, we got to do something nice for the farmer. He's taking good care of us. What can we do for him? And the chicken said, I have a bright idea. You know, the farmer loves to eat. Let's give him a nice meal. I'll provide the eggs. And you, Mr. Pig, you provide the bacon and the ham. Well, the story goes that the pig said, I don't think that's a very good idea because all that's required of you is involvement. But for me, it requires a full commitment. What does God require from us? He wants all of our talents, skills, abilities. He wants us to give our all to him. He requires a full commitment. And if we turn that equation around, we know that God held nothing back from us. He gave his all. He even sent his Son, his beloved Son, Jesus Christ, to die on the cross for us. He's fully in. He's fully committed to you and to me. He holds nothing back. Oh, this story of God's love, it's a story of an unreasonable love. It's a story of an unreserved love. And let me just suggest to you, too, that it's also the story of an unrestricted love. An unrestricted love. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Whosoever. That's the key word. It's for everybody. You see, to receive God's love does not require a set of credentials, qualifications, or achievements. Instead of just a hand-selected few being chosen for salvation, for sanctification, for a purposeful life, Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. It's for the whosoever. Edward Joy wrote a book called The Old Core, and it tells of his experiences in the early days of the Salvation Army. I'm talking about 1880s, 1890s in England. Edward Joy, The Old Core. And in this particular book, he tells the story of one particular Sunday night meeting they had. And on this particular occasion, when they were getting ready for the meeting to start, Lady B showed up. Now that was a big deal, because Lady B wasn't like most of the other early Salvationists. No, she was wealthy. She was elegant. She was beautifully dressed. She was cultured. She was charming. She was well-spoken. She showed up for the meeting in a horse-drawn carriage. She had 2 footmen, a driver. And when she went to sit down on the hardwood bench in the core, she had a maid who actually put a little soft cushion down on which for her to sit. Lady B was in the house, and when she was there, the people that were on stage sat up straight and hoped that she would notice. Everybody felt honored to have Lady B in the meeting. But that same night, there was somebody else who showed up for the meeting. His name was Jimmy. And he wasn't so welcome. Even in the early days of the Salvation Army, his nickname was Dirty Jimmy. He was horrible, Joy writes. He was stinking, unwashed, ragged, and verminous. I can tell you, nobody felt honored to have Dirty Jimmy in the meeting. So here we have the meeting going on. We've got Lady B on one side of the aisle and Dirty Jimmy on the other. And the story goes that the sermon was preached, the invitation was given, and just like we have here at Singapore Central, some people came down and knelt at the altar. And one of the first people to get up was Lady B. Lady B made her way down to the altar and she knelt there. And when people saw Lady B praying, there was kind of a hush that came across the congregation. It was a beautiful moment. People were hushed in reverent prayer for this beautiful, elegant, well-spoken, cultured lady. But a little later on, in that time of reflection and response, somebody else got up to pray. It was Dirty Jimmy. And the story goes that Dirty Jimmy kind of staggered down the aisle. And much to the horror of the congregation, he knelt and prayed right next to Lady B. He was crying. He was sobbing. Tears were running down his grimy cheeks. They were wetting the altar. The aroma of Dirty Jimmy was rising, and people could smell him, even in the back row. Well, the corps officer was a little concerned that maybe he was going to be a nuisance to Lady B. And the story goes he walked over to where Dirty Jimmy was kneeling, and he said, "Jimmy, move along and pray over there." But Lady B raised her eyes with her own tears coming down her cheeks and said, "No, leave him alone, Captain. We're both seeking the same Savior." And look, that's a powerful message from the early days of the Salvation Army. You know, we all come before God. And we may be the smartest, most intelligent, best-looking person in the congregation. You may be the person with the thickest bank account. Or you may be a scoundrel. And my guess is that in a congregation like this, we've got one or two scoundrels. Please raise your hand. I'm the worst of sinners, believe me. And yet in the sight of God, He loves us, He accepts us just as we are. See, it's a message of love for the whosoever. Oh, my friends, God's love is a story of an unrestricted love. It's an offer of an unreserved love, and it's an unreasonable love. But I have to say to you too, my friends, that it's also a story, sadly, of an unrealized love. An unrealized love. For God did not send His Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through Him might be saved. He who believes in Him is not condemned, but he who does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. The reality is some people reject the gift. Some people reject the opportunity to have the trajectory of their life changed. Are you such a person? Back in my country, there's a group of people, concerned citizens, who are against the vaccination of children. They're against the vaccination of children because they believe that it leads to autism. Now, there really is no scientific evidence to back that up. But that's their belief. It's a free country. And they share that information. And because of that information that they share, there are many parents who choose not to have their children vaccinated. And I think to myself, that could be a real tragedy. Because if you vaccinate your child, you may prevent them from getting the flu or the mumps or polio or some other kind of preventable disease. And yet because of misinformation, mistrust, misunderstanding, many parents deny their children that life-altering medical procedure. And in a sense, we're offered this opportunity to have this relationship with God, and it can change the trajectory of our life. It can help us be saved, prevented from all sorts of disastrous things that can come our way, and yet often because of distrust, misinformation, misunderstanding, we choose to reject God's life-altering work in our lives. Have you accepted Christ? Have you submitted to the sanctification of the Holy Spirit in your life? Are you living a life of purpose? where you're maximizing your potential to serve Him and others. Oh, my friends, sometimes it's an unrealized love. Well, look, I'm going to draw it to a close in just a moment, but I'm just reminded we have much to be thankful for, because there's lots of expressions in the world in which we live of people who show love and compassion and kindness and goodness to others. We can celebrate that today. I was at Changi Prison not too long ago with the Commissioner's Lim. They gave me a tour of Changi Prison, which is a very important place in the history of Singapore, particularly World War II. And you remember thousands of people were imprisoned in that very small space. It was a place of suffering. But there were examples of heroism even at Changi Prison. And one of those heroes was a man by the name of Alan Lord, and maybe that name means something to you. His parents were Commissioners Lord. They were the ones that founded the work of the Salvation Army in Singapore in the 1930s and 1940s. They would go on and start the Salvation Army in Korea. Alan was their son, and he was involved in a corps just like this one. He was a youth worker. He was kind. He was gentle. He was well loved by everybody. He ended up in Changi Prison in 1942, along with thousands of others. And the story goes that he took that Christian character that he had shown before he went to Changi Prison into the prison. He became a chaplain's assistant, and he was reminded or remembered as someone who was, helpful and sacrificial and kind, and someone who reached out to the other prisoners in any way that he could. And as the war progressed, the Japanese began to send laborers, prisoners, up to Burma and to Thailand to build railroads and so forth. Now, Alan wasn't selected to go, but he was concerned about the people that were being sent up there. Many of them were family men. Many of the prisoners were sick. Many of them were more than twice his age. And so what did Alan Lord do? He went to the Japanese and he volunteered to go in the place of another soldier. He volunteered to take their place. And he was selected to go. And so Alan Lord was sent up to Burma. He worked slave labor for as long as his body would allow him to last. And finally he succumbed in one of the infamous Burmese death marches, dead at the age of 23. Now, in a real sense, Alan Lord laid down his life so that others might live. His was an extraordinary act of selfless love. We ought to honor his life and his memory. But my friends, how much more is God's love demonstrated by the life of the Lord Jesus Christ? How much more is the capacity of God to meet our needs? Oh, the song lays it out for us beautifully. If men will often share their gladness, if men respond when children cry, if men can feel each other's sadness, each other's tears attempt to dry, then how much more shall God our Father in love forgive, in love forgive? Then how much more shall God our Father our wants supply and none deny? God's love, it's an unreasonable, unreserved, unrestricted kind of love. And yes, sometimes it's an unrealized love. What will be your response to God's offering of love today? Will we receive it for ourselves? Will we reflect it back to Him? Will we love others as Christ has called us to do? Well, look, I'm not sure what kind of challenges you may be facing today, relationally, spiritually, emotionally, physically. Sometimes the problems of life can seem overwhelming, more than we can bear. But I've got good news for you. God's provision is more than adequate to meet your need and my need today. God's provision of love, of forgiveness, of compassion, of concern, of understanding is more than enough to meet the deepest needs of your heart and mine. In place of the heartache or stress we may be feeling, God offers us his generous provision. Will we receive it today? Look, I'd like to go back to just the previous slide. We're going to sing this third verse of the song that Shelley introduced to us earlier today. And as we sing, the worship band will get in place, and they'll lead us later on in our time of reflection and response. But perhaps today you realize that as you think about your life and kind of where you are, maybe you could receive today. You need an extra provision of God's love, his care, his compassion for you to meet your needs. And here at this beautiful place of prayer, God is waiting for you to conduct spiritual business. You come if God is leading you, and you pray as we sing. If you will often share their gladness, if men respond when children cry, if men can feel each other's sadness, each other's tears attempt to dry, then how much more shall God our Father in love forgive, in love forgive, then how much more